Well, it seems that you all just settled down, so that's my cue to start talking, I think. We're just leaving the door open just a few more minutes because I can constantly hear people on the stairwell out there trying to find their way up here. So in case someone is running a bit late, we'll just try and accommodate those. But thank you so much for being here. I've been so excited to do this talk. My name is Tanja Gotthardsen. I'm an independent anti-greenwashing specialist, but I sit here in these beautiful rooms together with 1508. And today I'm doing my presentation together with Marina from 1508, who's a designer here. And we have a lot of collaborations going, essentially because often when 1508 designs something for clients, there's also a lot of communications going on. And a lot of the clients also want to say something about whatever green initiative they believe they have. But for us, it's also about not just questioning whether the terminology is right, it's also about questioning, are we actually pursuing the right goals? Are we actually solving anything? So today, I will take you beyond greenwashing. So if you came here for the compliance bit, I'm sorry, you're not gonna get that as much. But hopefully, I'll give you something more that's much more effective, namely something to think with. So we're going beyond greenwashing and trying to move into what I've dubbed sustainability literacy. Because what I find is that we don't have, and that's Ivan, he's our head of good vibes. So yeah, what I find is that currently we do not have the competencies to actually solve the issues that we're faced with. And that means that we always end up with some kind of incrementalism, if not greenwashing. So I will try to take you a bit through that, but I will also try to introduce to you my methodology, because when I work as an anti-greenwashing specialist and when I do public appearances, it's not just about the greenwashing. It's essentially because I think the greenwashing issue is a vehicle for a much bigger conversation. So just to center us for a bit before I move beyond it, greenwashing, as you know, is an overstatement of your positive impact. It can both pertain to environmental and social claims. And they fall into a vast number of categories. This is how, if you look at the research, it's compiled. So we have the selective disclosure. So that's just pointing to the things that you want people to look at while just brushing away all of your mess. Then we have the empty claims, the irrelevant claims with falsehoods. Just not credible might seem weird, but that's oil and gas companies saying that they care about the environment. And then we have inconsistent organizational practice. That one actually also ties in with political spin, because a lot of the policies are actually also observant when it comes to whether a company lobbies behind the scenes. And we see quite a bit of that. And if you saw my front page, you will see that we have some guys behind the wheel, and we'll get back to those. But when we look at these vast and different ways of greenwashing, what we can also see is there's something down here that has to do with misleading imagery and jargon. And I just added those in because what I want to also state today very clearly is that our policies and greenwashing is not just a matter of claims, it's a matter of perception. So if your audience can in any way misinterpret what you're trying to position, well, it's on you. So it's all about being very, very clear and not overstating what we do. Now, this is something I pursue in multiple ways. And for those who don't know me, I have been running cases in the public eye for, 5-7 years now. I've had my company for the past 7. And I have pursued cases against, for example, Zalando. They had 25,000 products on their websites with a green sustainability flag on it. 25,000 products. Ladies and gentlemen, wouldn't we have solved the crisis already if that was the case? And aside from that, I've also pursued, for example, Copenhagen Fashion Week. It's not that I just focus on fashion, but when I do these cases in the public eye, it essentially has to do with us all wearing clothes. It's something very close to us. It's something very material. But I also have a tendency to write very annoying letters to the European Commission because I sit in hearing processes, because I want our policies to get as good as they can get. So I do that on a European level, and I also do that nationally. Because as I will get back to, how these policies look is very, very important. And today we have an issue when it comes to how science-aligned our policies are. But we'll get back to it. Greenwashing is just a symptom of a deeper systemic design. And if we only focus on the greenwashing, we overlook a vast number of issues here. And Marina will also take us into how some of this materializes when she talks about branding when I'm done with my bit. But this design is something that has continuously commercialized and relativized sustainability, because what it does is it co-opts. And what you will see is that it's not just about a word such as sustainability being co-opted. You might also have started to see words like regenerative become co-opted. And all sorts of, every time we have a progressive word, it gets co-opted and watered down. And what it essentially does is it leaves us without a common language to mobilize from. So for me, it's also very much about protecting not just the words, but our foundation for mobilization. But this design that I'm talking about is a design that says that we can have perpetual growth on a finite planet, which is completely bonkers. And I will try and show you why that is bonkers. Because the greenwashing is in service of this narrative. And it's not just about it being possible, it's supposedly also desirable for all of us to have perpetual growth. I can tell you already, it isn't. Because the fact is that we live on a planet with finite resources and we're in pretty deep shit. Sorry for my language. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this model, but I'll just walk you through it. These are the 9 planetary boundaries. This is where science has sat down, thousands of scientists looking at what conditions on Earth makes it conducive to life. So when this beauty pulses, it's not because the planet is dying, it is because we're deteriorating our possibility of actually existing within its boundaries. We are very, very deeply connected to its functioning. And when we talk about sustainability today, it's always watered down to a question of climate change. But as what you'll see here is that it's just 1 out of 9. And focusing on CO2 will not cut it for us. The other planetary boundaries, for example, relate to how we constantly accumulate plastics, other human and man-made substances in our environment. And they don't just end up in the environment, they also end up in us. But also these novel entities, as they're called, they actually negatively affect all the other planetary boundaries. Then we have the loss of biodiversity. That's up here with biosphere integrity. We, for example, also have the biogeochemical flows. That is nitrogen and phosphorus, kvælstof, which some of you might have seen in the news that our coastline in Denmark is suffocating. That is in fact due to this. And we also have the way that we use the land available to us, arealanvendelse. And all of these 9, I won't go through them all, but all of these 9 interconnect. They are our basis for existing with the level of comfort that we're somewhat accustomed to. After these are breached, it won't be as fun. And I'll go into that a bit as well. But what you can see over here is that they have been quantified over time. So back in 2009, we had 3 boundaries crossed. Then in 15, we had more quantified, but we have 4 boundaries crossed. Then in 23, we had 6 boundaries crossed. And this summer we crossed the 7th one, ocean acidification. This is the world's saddest bingo. I mean, it is so incredibly sad that it feels like that we're just trying to fill this one out. And when we only focus on the CO2, we won't do anything but incremental change. Because, to give you one example, if we only focus on CO2, then we might argue that instead of organic farming, we can just do conventional, because it's much more intensive, or in some cases at least more intensive in terms of output. But what it then does is that it puts pressure down here on the biogeochemical flows. And that's how we at the moment just burden shift within the system. So I want you to take this into account. I want you to just, if one thing you take out of this room today is, there are boundaries. And these boundaries is what I think should be taught to us at an elementary school level, because this is our foundation for being here. And the overwhelming conclusion from the scientific literature That is that a sufficient absolute decoupling of economic growth from environmental pressures is not happening at anywhere near the scale needed. In fact, such a decoupling appears unlikely to ever occur. So the idea that we can just continue to grow our economy, fix everything up with technology, well, according to the scientists, it's not going to happen. So, and that's also because it defies the laws of thermodynamics. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I figured that'll be a bit too heavy this Wednesday morning. But also, it's such a shame that we are continuing to overshoot these boundaries when we could, in fact, be developing something that's really, really wonderful. We could be provisioning for sufficiency, for tilstrækkelighed, where everyone has their needs met. But unfortunately, at the moment, we have very few people having their needs met. Down here, we have a lot of people not having that, happen. And the 50% poorest people, they might only, emit 8% of the emissions. But according to Oxfam in this case, they take on between 80 and 90% of the economic costs relating to climate change. So they don't emit, but they sure as hell do pay. And that in itself is such a big distributive injustice. And it also points to something else, namely that when we have this skewed system that we have today, that is essentially also what allows for this degradation. Because a lot of things today are not priced according to their value, whether it be human labor or the resources that we extract. So just to say, we have to talk about the economy. And we have to talk about provisioning for sufficiency. And I'm happy to say that we have a bunch of wonderful scientists looking at how that might look, even in a Danish context. What is a sufficiency consumption like? Well, they have a bunch of answers for us. And we might not like them immediately, because it might mean, amping down how big our houses are or how much we buy on a daily basis. But in the end, I think it might also make room for something much more valuable, something that we're all, in a sense, longing for. A way to very briefly also conceptualize sustainability is that we have this ecological ceiling with the 9 planetary boundaries, and then we have an inner circle. Those are our social thresholds. Those really relate to our needs or the foundation for our well-being as people. And between these two circles, you can see that there is a safe and just space for humanity. And I'm very happy to tell you that according to science, that is actually possible. Now, you might have heard that Denmark is a green frontrunner. And I can tell you that just through this graph, that's a big fat lie. Those guys who are performing best in this, staying within planetary boundaries and fulfilling social needs, that's Costa Rica and Mauritius. We are over here, together with Sweden and Norway, overusing resources day in and day out, needing more than 4 planets if everyone lived like we do, so on and so forth. So next time you see Dan Jørgensen, I don't want to say you have to sucker punch him, but just feel that sense of frustration when he stands there with his stupid hockey stick. Because, it is, when you know all of what I just said, it is infuriating. Okay, now I've talked to you about what some might argue is the progressive science, but I also wanted to show you what the conservatives say. Because we have an institution called the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. And if I'm to tell you who they are, they're a bunch of insurance guys and mathematicians, essentially. That's how their minds work. And they're very conservative. They just came out with this report. And what it tells us is that our dominant economic model doesn't recognize a dependence on Earth systems, viewing climate and nature risks as externalities. So the paradigm we're in, the system that we're in, it doesn't account for our biophysical reality. Then it also says more than half the land suitable to grow wheat and maize could be lost. It goes on by 2030. 2030. There could be a 40% shortfall in global water supply if there are no changes made to water management. And then it says, a technique known as reverse stress testing suggests to expect a 50% GDP destruction somewhere between 2070 and 2090. Essentially, it means that the global economy will shrink by design or by disaster. In this case, if we continue as we do now, it'll be by disaster. So again, this notion of perpetual growth, is just not scientifically sound. And that's something I really, really want you guys to try and take home, if you don't already know it. Also because when we then look at businesses and organizations, this is from another report. This is from a report by someone called Alice Kallrup. And she works very specifically with high-level executives. But she has found in her work, and this graph over here is highly depressing, so I won't go too far into it, but she has tried to collate all of these different impacts that will happen according to the science. And what we see here is that between 2020 and 2040, we might already see the loss of access to food for 1 to 2 billion people. And then from there on, it just spirals, because that is what happens if we go beyond 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels to 1.8 and 2 degrees Celsius. And I have to tell you that the past 2 years, we have been beyond 1.5 degrees. We have been hitting 1.54 degrees for the past 2 years. So whenever someone says that we have time, I just want to urge you to rethink that. We need to act now. But what she also has found talking to all of these different businesses is that the current scenario is projected to feature a cascade of events leading to entire industries becoming unviable in the 2030s, with a subsequent economic shock and shrinking of the global economy that will likely affect most, if not all, medium and large-sized businesses around the world. And she goes on. Organizations design strategies, business and investment plans, and so on, based on assumptions that simply do not hold, to deliver success in future scenarios that are no longer plausible. So the way that we try to engage with this topic today is just not up to scratch. We're trying to design from a logic that is no longer viable. We've tried to take a logic, and Marina will also in many ways showcase that when she goes into the branding of it. We've just duplicated a logic that got us into the problem in the first place. So our conceptualization of sustainability, it matters. If we water it down, guess what? We're in deep shit. We already are. But it's also, I want to really, really stress, for organizations who want to be contributing in any way to lessening harm, or who just want some sort of strategic foresight, we need a strong definition. It's the only way to plan forward. So, because I'm a nerd, I have been looking at the past 40 years of research into how sustainability is conceptualized. And what we find is that we have the systematic, economic, and relative dimensions. Those are the ones we see over here. One of them is called compliance, and that's called very weak, because if the policies are not strong, and if the only reason you as an organization even try to tackle some of these issues is compliance, then guess what? We're not getting that far. Then we have the business-centered. It's often the doing less bad narrative that ends up, driving that. Then we have the emerging mindset. It's about doing more good, but it's still colored by marketing. And then we have a common denominator for these three, and it is that growth is always at the center one way or another. These two might talk about the triple bottom line, which you might know. So the interconnections between the social, economic, and environmental. Well, the thing just is that the economy in itself is not a goal. It is a means. The goals are social and environmental, right? So the whole triple bottom line actually skews our perspective. And even the guy who made it has said that it was a pretty bad idea, and he's tried to revise it. But then if we move further, then we can look into what I've dubbed post-growth and co-evolutionary perspectives. These are strong and very strong. This one over here I call going full Pocahontas, because that's about, experiencing ourselves as part of the system in a way that is not as hierarchical. But we can already engage over in the post-growth section, because it becomes about repairing damages and meeting needs rather than creating needs and then trying to sell people the idea that we're doing more good while we're doing it. And I think one of the key examples of doing more good, emerging mindset, might be Patagonia. Because guess what? All of their nature donations, they stand on the shoulders of, creating plastic clothing. Yeah. Moving on. These three over here, they come with an increased greenwashing risk because it's very easy to overstate your good doing over here. It's not to say that you, within these three, might not be able to make concrete claims that might fly, but they're not changing anything really. So sustainability also, if we read it with all of that in mind, this is the definition that underlies UN policies, but also even the Danish anti-greenwashing policy. We have a definition for sustainability. It's not just something we make up ourselves. The definition is sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You've probably heard this one, right? Well, guess what? There's a sentence that almost everyone overlooks. The sentence that follows this is, in particular, the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given. And this definition very clearly shows us that sustainability is not just a question of the environment. It is also something that very heavily interlinks with us, because guess who's having a lot of the impact on the system that we're in, right? So we have a definition, and we need to read that definition with this in mind so we don't fall into the falsities of just trying to technologically fix things with a hockey stick. This one tells us that we should be asking ourselves, what do we really want? What do we really need? And then we should try to cut a lot of the crap. Also because, just to give you one example, I see that we have stuffication in many ways. Stuffication. For example, you will see some places in like a small Danish town, you will see these racks of clothing just on the pavement. And for me, that's just like, that is our wardrobes overflowing onto the pavement, because if we actually loved those things, we wouldn't just hang them out there in the rain and wind. But it seems that we are at a point now where our things are just overflowing. The same goes to everything that we donate. Everything is just moving so quickly through our lives. So what if we asked, what is actually giving us value? And I think that also I talked to a colleague who had a very powerful question. She said, maybe we should start with the question, what do you long for? Because that question points to something that is not necessarily a material thing we buy or sell. It's about community and all sorts of other wonderful things. But also when it comes to actually recalibrating our nervous systems, we need one another. That is actually something we do together. So there's a lot of wonderful things to go into if you do not read this as Dan Jørgensen kind of has decided to do. But also I just wanted to, from the science, give you another perspective that just adds up to what I've been saying, because at the Danish Technical University, they have a professor called Michael, and Michael has said something very, very smart. He was asked, is there any sustainable product out there? And he said, no. Very briefly, no. Because sustainability is the sum of the system. It's not something one product is in isolation. It's not something one company is in isolation. And he goes through saying that we can rather talk about having a lifestyle within boundaries for thing needs. And I won't read it out loud to you, but that's what it says. He talks about whether you can have red meat or take a flight somewhere nice. But again, where you can choose one and not the other. But just looking at where we're at, it should not just be perhaps be about selecting between the two. Perhaps we have to think a bit more radically. So sustainability is a matter of a sum of the system. It's not a more or less. What we can talk about as a more or less is whether or not we are more or less deteriorating the planet. It's not something we buy or sell. That commercialization in itself is so highly problematic. And trying to sell sustainability, and I won't go into that today, but there's a lot of research also that shows that green marketing might give us moral license to just continue to purchase more stuff. So those green claims are not necessarily helping us redirect our consumption in a meaningful way. And understanding this, that it's not something we buy or sell, that is the first guardrail against greenwashing, but it's also the first pillar of having literacy in this matter. So, and also in Denmark, we are actually quite lucky that we have some policy alignment. It's not that the entire anti-greenwashing policy on this issue is perfect, but it says something really nice, I think, because in our Consumer Ombudsman, that's actually what it's called in English, In our Consumer Ombudsman's guidance, it says it is very difficult to call a product, etc., sustainable without misleading. The Consumer Ombudsman therefore recommends that companies do not use sustainability statements in their marketing. So if you work for a company that has sustainability statements, please go home and remove them. Thank you. But also, the fact remains from where I'm standing that one policy, of course, won't change the mess that we're in. So I'm just going to take a slight deep dive with you into how my mind works, because we need to think systemically. And this model for me has been quite important in trying just to wrap my mind around things. It's Donella Meadows' Leverage Points. She was one of the authors behind a book from 1972 that had the name Limits to Growth. Yes, 50 years ago. Now, what Donella also, after that, was pushed hardly, it was pushed to the background by especially oil and gas companies. She sat down to figure out, okay, so how do we change the systems? And she looked at the leverage points we have. So a lever, like when you pull a lever, if you pull up here, it's going to be more effective than pulling down here. The lower points, from my point of departure, talking about greenwashing, that might be, for example, just to give people bigger fines for greenwashing. Well, that might not essentially change the issue at hand, and we might not get, the bigger scope of what I've been talking about. If we go into information flows, if we jump from these and up here, then it becomes about who knows what. And that, I think, is quite powerful, and that's why it makes sense for us to have a room like this. But if we really want to change something, then we have to work on the rules of the system. That's why I do the policy hearings, because we also have to essentially change the goal of the system. And this one is very hard to really, reach. This is something, and this is to say, this is not something one person does. We have to collaborate. But we need to go up here and assess what is the goal, because if the goal continues to be economic growth on a finite planet, we're screwed. And that essentially then does the wonderful thing to change our mindsets. That is what a paradigm is. That is, the way that we understand the world we're in. That is something that's actually constructed. And that is also, at the very end, you'll see there's something that's called the power to see paradigms as such. And that's a very, very important skill. Because where we're at the moment, that was built. And I will recommend these two books for you, because the system that we're in was built so skillfully that we've become unaware of what it actually is. And these two books give parts of the story. In The Big Myth, Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway, they look at how in the US, the concept of, for example, economic growth and growth as freedom was distributed in American households. I think it was 14 million American households that had pamphlets trying to lure them into this kind of storyline. And some of these also, for Christian conservative demographies in the US, they actually made pamphlets where some of these concepts of the system that we're in, it was positioned like, Moses coming, not Moses, but the 10 Commandments from the Bible. So they took their political child and just put it into a format that they knew would, highly work with the audience that they were trying to affect. And I think that's so crazy. But that also just goes to show that we are, able to reset our minds. And I think we should really try to dive further into that. So I will recommend these two books because they help us understand that where we're at is too constructed. But as Marina also said to me yesterday, and this is a quite famous quote, it is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. But we need to change that, and we need to change it fast. So beyond greenwashing, what I'm preoccupied with is essentially that we have a common language, and we have an understanding to mobilize from. As long as we water down what this is all about, we won't get anywhere. So for me, it's all about trying to create some kind of literacy. And that's not to say that the presentation that I'm doing today will, of course, because I have such limited time, it will be reductionist. And for me, speaking as just one person, it will, of course, be reductionist. But I'm trying to just, take some of the dogmas, at least, for us to think from. So Hereby your literacy booster. Sustainability is the sum of the system, not something we buy or sell. Planetary boundaries exist and focusing on carbon won't cut it. Our basic needs and well-being interrelate with set boundaries. Weak conceptualizations of sustainability often end up in greenwashing and, incremental efforts won't get us anywhere. And almost no organizations today have strategies and structures in place that cannot be overruled by short-term economic incentives. And then, Danish anti-greenwashing policies have gotten increasingly better. How we use them, however, is where the systemic magic happens. So if we can use these to kind of, foster a sense of what this actually means, if we can try and, remove some of the bullshit, then we might be better off. So let's get out, because I have been battling fossil fuel lobbyists for quite a few years in set hearings, and they are not gonna do us any favors. And they will continue to bring their growth fetishism and greenwashing into the system. So I also think that rather than just being consumers, we have to consider how we're actually actively citizens. We are not just consumers, we're citizens. And then, final quote from me, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And I will be taking questions after, but I want to give you on to Marina and just say thank you for your time. Thank you for listening so pleasantly. Thank you.
Let's hope that this works. Yes.
Beautiful.
Okay. I hope you don't expect me to raise the mood in here. I know this was all quite depressing, and it's going to get a little bit, or it's going to stay a little bit depressing for a little while, because I will talk about what role branding has played into getting us into this whole mess that Tanya has just explained to us. And we're getting a bit nerdy with the history of branding because it really can help us understand how we got here. And especially I'm going to pinpoint the times where branding has been a tool of capitalism. But before I do that, first, two definitions. So when I talk about capitalism, I talk about a system where private individuals and businesses own the means of production and control them in their own interests, the primary goal being to maximize profits. The owners of production employ workers who receive wages and produce products and services which are exchanged on a competitive market. So, of course, not all of these are an invention of capitalism. Most of these have existed before, like commodity production and the market exchange. But what we are mainly critiquing is the private ownership and the profit maximization, because they are the root of the accumulation of capital, and therefore increased inequality and also that strive for infinite economic growth on a planet with very finite resources. And when I talk about branding, I mean the action of creating or maintaining a brand, which is a name, term, design, symbol, or any other feature that identifies one seller's good or service as distinct from those of other sellers. Now let's get into the history. And I'm not starting all the way in the beginning of time, but with the first instances of branding physical products. So craftspeople have always been marking their tools or their creations with little symbols or their initials, etc. And then in the Middle Ages, they had these guilds, which were associations of craftspeople. And these guilds came up with merchant marks to symbolize if it was to identify ownership or to keep track of goods. And these symbols also later on became signs of authentication and signs of quality. Then in the Industrial Revolution, in the beginning, the craftspeople don't fully get replaced by machines yet, but their task changes from first manually producing an object to now operating a machine that produces an object. So the market was soon flooded with identical mass-produced products, and in the beginning they were of a much lower quality than the handmade products. So to compensate for that lack of quality and for that lack of personality and to stand out from the competitors, companies started hiring artists to create narratives and to create names and symbols, and these artists didn't know anything about how these products were actually produced. And this is where we first had some of the first trademarks. And they were the first instances of branding as intellectual property. Then, in the early 20th century, new and more efficient production plants got popularized. So now we also needed more efficient ways to sell all of that product that was being overproduced, because otherwise the production facility would not have been profitable. And that's where we start getting into the deep shit, because advertisers started turning to psychological theories, for example, the ones of Sigmund Freud on sexual desire or oral fixation, to sell all of these new brands and new products. So that is already where we have that shift in marketing, that we're not selling something that fulfills a need anymore, but something where we manufacture a desire by using psychological tactics. And there's a very revealing quote of that time, which is, "The community that can be trained to desire change, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed, yields a market to be measured more by desires than by needs. And man's desires can be developed so that they will greatly overshadow his needs." So this is how consumer culture begins its rise. It wasn't something that evolved naturally and over time, but it was something that was very deliberately manufactured and created with intention. Then, throughout the middle of the 20th century, branding becomes increasingly important for businesses. And also around the same time, the term corporate social responsibility is born, but doesn't really become a thing until a few years later. And the first time that we see significant civil and political pressure on businesses to engage in any sort of social responsibility was in the 70s, so also around the same time that we had the limits to growth. And these pressures were mainly to pay fair wages or to withdraw from nuclear energy. So citizens, unions, but also governments nudged companies to engage more systemically. And then that all gets ruined by a big wave of neoliberalism starting in the 80s. So governments, mainly in the UK and the US, but also on European mainland, heavily started pushing deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. So for one, this meant taking off the pressure of the businesses to engage in any sort of social responsibility. And on the other hand, because of the wave of privatization, that meant that a lot of previously public services like healthcare, communications, education, public transport, etc., got turned into a product that needed to be sold and that needed to make a profit. And of course, these products and services needed logos and advertising to compete on the new free market. So branding in that case was used as a tool to enclose the commons. So to turn something that was previously deemed a public necessity that was provided by a public institution, turning it into something commercial that you had to be able to afford and that had to make money for its shareholders. And a very recent example of how this is very much not a thing of the past but has gotten even worse today is the case of Nestle privatizing water, where their chairman has even called it an extremist opinion to think that human beings should have a right to water. So not a thing of the 80s, still very much alive today. And then some of these liberalizations in the 80s also helped globalization progress really fast in the 90s. So for example, the trade liberalization opened up foreign markets and also made it possible to move manufacturing to countries with cheaper labor and cheaper resources. And there's kind of a rhyme here between the 90s and the era where craftspeople got replaced by machines, and then artists had to figure out how to come up with stories without knowing anything behind the product. So we have this exact same thing now again, that the world of production and the world of consumption have to stay apart. And it's the very job of branding to detach these two worlds and detach the production and the labor conditions from how a product is marketed. And there's a few different branding tools to help achieve that. So in the 90s, we also have the rise of the lifestyle brand, where we don't just detach the production of the product from how we market it, but also the actual functionality and purpose of a product from how we market it. So branding is no longer about the actual product. Instead, it promotes a lifestyle, and it kind of embeds itself as a part of a culture, often also using popular celebrities who are standing as representatives for a specific desirable culture or lifestyle. And another branding tool that evolved in the 90s was cause-related marketing. which means aligning companies with causes that consumers feel strongly about. So corporate social responsibility, or CSR, now becomes a branding tool. And the 90s are kind of the start of selling political values as a part of your brand identity. A psychologist in the 90s has said very fittingly about the role of branding. Brands are now gunning for a share of consumers' inner lives, their values, their beliefs, their politics, yes, their souls. By the 2000s, CSR has become more widespread and very essential to business strategy and brand identity of a lot of companies. But the approach was very much focused on how this could help you grow your business or could help you improve your reputation instead of trying to have an actual positive impact on the planet or on people. And the most prominent example of this is the BP rebranding, which is also a prime example of greenwashing. So the goal obviously was to position BP as an environmentally sensitive company, but they most likely spent more money on this insanely expensive rebranding and campaign than they ever did on renewable energy, or what they call beyond petroleum. Yes, that's great. Then in the early 2010s, the trust in business drops even further after global financial crisis. So that also means that the pressure rises for companies to engage more in social responsibility and to be transparent, that's the word, transparent about the social and environmental impact that they have, but also the contributions that they do. Which also means that now branding and marketing campaigns become more political. You might have seen this little circle before, which is about the brand purpose. So the reason why a brand exists beyond just making money. That becomes a huge thing in that era and basically essential for any brand who wanted to stay relevant. But again, the claims are very tame and they don't really address the underlying issue and the underlying system that causes these social injustices and the planetary degradation in the first place. As an example, there's H&M's Close the Loop program that tells its customers there are no rules in fashion but one, to recycle your clothes. Of course, H&M never addressed the underlying issue that fast fashion churns out these insane amount of clothes in the first place, and instead places the responsibility on the individual consumer and says, you can save the planet if you just recycle your clothes. And also, if you want to be even more picky about this campaign, even if they would have even managed to close the loop, a growing loop is still inflicting environmental pressure. So that's also how we get into how circularity has been co-opted by growth. Because yes, you can make, first of all, no, you can never make a fully circular system or like money loop. But also if that circle is growing, it's just going to be the same issue again. So we've almost arrived in the present time and are now in the era of brand activism, which consists of business efforts to promote, impede, or direct social, political, economic, and/or environmental reform. So now we see brands very concretely align with specific progressive activist movements like Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. But whatever positive this corporate activism might have, it is usually outweighed by the harms that businesses cause by co-opting and commercializing a movement. Especially because they rarely change any of the harmful structures in their business structures or in their value chains. So Nike will champion an athlete who fights against the oppression of Black people in the US, but then they go and underpay the workers that are producing their clothes, which are most often racialized minorities. So when brands only support a movement that is already popular and only because it supports the bottom line, this whole corporate activism reduces a cost to a tool for selling more sneakers or selling more razors, etc. And of course, the same has happened to sustainability and the environmental movement. It has been watered down and commercialized so much that the word itself, the visuals, and the language around it have essentially lost all of their meaning. And brands and businesses have made us believe that sustainability is something that we can purchase. And if we just take a second to think about it, we'll all realize how absolutely wild it is that we are trying to solve a problem with the same thing that has got us into this mess in the first place. And branding is one of the main factors of how we got into this mess. Because of that switch of marketing, from marketing an actual product to now marketing a lifestyle and emotions and values, etc., we've now ended up in this rabbit hole where we construct our identities by the things that we possess. So branding and advertising prey on this very existential feeling that there's something missing in our lives, that we're not living up to our full potential, that if we only just owned this one more thing, then we would be better looking, healthier, more desirable, more successful, etc. Or that we need a certain thing to belong to a specific group and to be accepted. And now that people increasingly care about the environment and about social causes, they also expect brands to deliver on these and contribute to these causes. But when brands start marketing these values and aligning themselves with these causes, branding turns products into some sort of value status symbol. So what I decide to purchase is gonna be a declaration of my morals. My Patagonia jacket means that I care about the environment, my Christiania bike means that I care about local production and supporting the underdog, etc. And the branding industry has really managed to make it seem like we can shop our way out of these multiple crises that we are in. Because brands keep telling people that it is completely fine to keep consuming at the current rate as long as you're shopping the right stuff. Then you can do it without any guilt, keep on shopping. And that completely ignores the fact that it's actually less important what brand we consume and more important that we in the global north consume less overall. So this kind of messaging of a moral purchase decision actually incentivizes us to consume more, as Tanya has already said, because it turns shopping into a morally good action. And we see this problem right now with second-hand fashion platforms. Like Vinted, they are considered as the solution to, or that sustainable solution to the fast fashion industry, but they are very much still fueling our need and our addiction to consumption and the need to stay on trend, etc. So this kind of framing absolutely does not solve the issue, and instead it conditions us to be consumers and not political citizens. So looking back at the history of branding, we can see that time and time again, the more consumers become aware of environmental or social injustices, the more sophisticated become the methods that brands use to make it look like they are contributing to a solution when they're actually upholding the structures that are the cause of the majority of these problems. And because of all these crises and the accumulation of capital and the exploitation of the people and planet in order to accumulate capital, that's a hard word to say, to accumulate capital, they are not flaws or bugs of a system. They are the very features and characteristics of capitalism. So if you would ask Tanya or me if there is such a thing as ethical branding or marketing under the current system, our answer would be no. Because we are living so far beyond our needs that any product or any service that is not based on a sufficiency approach should not be marketed and take up no space in our public spaces or in our minds. So to even have a chance of doing branding ethically, we would have to start with that sufficiency-based approach. But we could also use branding and design to help shift the current system. We really have perfected to manufacture and market desires, so we could also help that to change the paradigm. Why can't we not use that knowledge to make a sufficiency-based lifestyle or a sufficiency-based economic system desirable? This goes a little bit into what Tanya has mentioned before about shifting a paradigm as being one of the more powerful levers on the scale. Or if we look further than branding, we could instead focus on how to help businesses transition to sufficiency-based products or sufficiency-based services, or also support and connect organizations who are already working on systemic transition. So I've been pointing the finger at a lot of different brands and a lot of different companies. So just a few words on what we are trying to achieve within that field here in 1508. Our background originally is creating digital experiences, but we've extended our offer and now also work with transition design with the goal of facilitating systemic transitions. And we try to do that in two ways. One is assisting companies aspiring for change. So a lot of companies talk about change but fall short on their approach and then end up reinforcing harmful systems. Because a lot of times they only focus on the symptoms of these deeper systemic failures than on the root. And what we can do is help develop a more critical perspective and a deeper understanding of these systems that they need to intervene in, and also address the root cause of these issues that they want to change. And the other pillar is building communities of practice. So many organizations and individuals are already working towards the same goal, but a lot of times they're not fully aware of each other. So that means that the whole movement stays fragmented. And what we can do is to help raise funds to make it possible that these individual parts can come together and work towards a common goal and learn from each other in order to find out how can we shape the systems of the future. Now, before we go into a question round, we would like to show you a little video that really hits the nail on the head, that all of this is not any individual's fault, but a result of a failed system, and also that it is incredibly hard to be a good person in the system. And maybe it can lighten the mood a bit after we've teared it down. Maybe it makes you even more desperate. We will see.
All along, I've only been looking at one duck, but there's millions of ducks in here. In 1534, Douglas Linegar of Hawkhurst, England, gave his grandmother roses for her birthday. He picked them himself, walked them over to her. She was happy. Boom, 145 points. Now, yeah, here we go. In 2009, Doug Ewing of Skaggsville, Maryland, also gave his grandmother a dozen roses, but he lost 4 points. Why? Because he ordered roses using a cell phone that was made in a sweatshop. The flowers were grown with toxic pesticides, picked by exploited migrant workers, delivered from thousands of miles away, which created a massive carbon footprint, and his money went to a billionaire racist CEO who sends his female employees pictures of his genitals.
This is a very odd thing to hear.
Don't you understand? The bad place isn't tampering with points. They don't have to. Because every day the world gets a little more complicated, and being a good person gets a little harder.
So yeah, that was essentially our 2 sets.
Yes.
And we're up for questions. And perhaps I should also just say briefly that if you're interested in trying to, move into talking more about systems, and if you're in a company and you're like, okay, how do we do this? Then we have Matthias in the back row, who leads the transition team here. And it's not that we have all the answers, but we're very keen to try and unlock those together. Again, we need community. This is not something solved by one entity, but we might as well get the conversation started. And now I'll leave it to you to converse with us. So, any questions? Any questions, or did we leave you in shock? I mean, we talked when we... Oh,
Could
that's
also
good.
do a therapy session.
Perfect. At the very back.
Perhaps with a bit of hope for also a bit of hope from you guys, because it's a very strong mission and very convincing, but not much of a strategy.
No.
It's not advertising, not focusing on CO2 emissions, but if you were to give some concrete advice where to start, how to initiate
Yes.
some kind of change.
So from where I'm standing, that common literacy is where I believe we should start, because we need to have an understanding of the system that we're in and the system that we're operating, right? So that's essentially my corner of this very, very big issue. But then to do something more concrete, we also have to focus on, the specific context of, let's say, an organization coming in here. So that is where we will set a team and try to, as best as we can, develop how to proceed from there. So the reason why we're not just putting out one big fat strategy for everyone is because of the complexity of this issue. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So we would much rather start a conversation on this, have people come in, have people interrelate, because that's essentially what we believe is necessary. I think so many consultants have just over the years tried to just sell you a quick fix. And that has left us in the world of McKinsey's. That hasn't really solved a bunch of things. So to answer your question briefly, I believe that the strategy should come when we sit down together, tackling some of the concrete issues in our vast, network of issues, and then trying to make ends meet between those. So that's why I don't give you a master plan. I hope that's an okay answer. Yes?
Yes, hi, thank you both for sharing with us today. So I get what you're saying, that us as practitioners need to have a basis of this literacy, right?
Mm.
And I think there's a certain amount of resource consumption where the point of pleasure diminishes, right? We can only consume so much of one thing before whatever existential value we ascribe to it loses its meaning. That's for space, that's for products. So we need to focus on branding less as luxury. And that goes for the spaces we consume, the items we have. Of course, it's not the stop-gap emergency brake that we need for the planet, which is like stop consuming at this level, but it's a stepping stone towards that mindset shift in your lever graph you were showing. So do you have examples of sufficiency branding or like branding that is that
Yeah, of course.
way?
Okay, so let me say that when it comes to sufficiency consumption, something that we could have marketed is, for example, repair cafes. Let's remove the marketing of all the new stuff that we're over-consuming, that we're consuming at rates that are so far beyond what we need, and then position the thing that we're really struggling to get people to do. So, for example, repairs. And along with that, we might also have to look at how, for example, in France, they have subsidies for people to repair their stuff. So that might be a way of going in and supporting sufficiency in that arena. Then with regard to, let's say, food, there would also be an opportunity here to develop marketing or branding of more plant-based options, right? Rather than it's Landbrug og Fødevarer that takes up all of the space around Copenhagen, why shouldn't that be available for, more, you could say, progressive ways of developing our food systems? Why shouldn't that be what we use also to make plant-based lifestyles more, enchanting in a way? Because as long as we continue to see just big fat beef patties all over, and as long as that's also marketed as a feature of masculinity, there's a lot of things that we might, struggle to reform. So that would be two examples just of, tapping into also, essentially, also the question of needs. There are, and that's a whole Morgenbooster in itself, right? What is a need? What is a need within this framework? So from that, we might be able to kind of figure out, okay, so what is that we need more of? What is it that we need less of? But I can tell you that discount flights and cruise ships might be an easy way to start, just to remove some of the things that are not really helping us. Do you have anything, Marina, on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And I think in a few years, I think we're going to be quite bewildered that we were allowed to advertise and brand so many harmful things. Like if you now look back, you're not allowed to advertise smoking in a lot of areas anymore. And I think if we get further with this policy change, like in France, you're not allowed to advertise ultra-fast fashion anymore. So I do think that branding will phase out, or at least the branding that is intended to make you buy more and to maximize profits. And then I think what you say about the marketing of plant-based products, I think that goes a little bit also into this using branding, using storytelling to help shift the paradigm, help make something that is the more sustainable alternative, as not just in a sense of like I'm marketing this product, but I'm actually marketing a whole lifestyle that is more or not more sustainable, but less deteriorating for the planet.
Yeah. And also, just to actually return back to the question of a big strategy, we have an organization globally that's called the Club of Rome. They were also the ones that sponsored that Limits to Growth report in 1972. They have been using, for 50 years, they've been using these very big computer modulations of various interconnecting impacts. And what they found is that there is like a top 5 of things that we have to tackle to move into what they then call a well-being economy, but essentially fulfilling human needs within planetary boundaries. And the first of them are tackling poverty. It then is about gender equality, and then it goes on through those, trying to like recenter us. And then it's not until we get to the 4th and 5th, it becomes about food systems and energy systems. Those are, according to them, the most important 5 to jump into. So there are charters out there made by, again, thousands of scientists who's been collating data for over 50 years. So there's enough to take from. Yes?
I'm curious. So transforming businesses and transforming capitalism as a system is vastly, tremendously complex.
Yes.
From my vantage point, having worked in Ulster for a lot of years and seeing the people actually running the sustainability machine and how they stakeholder engagement within the organization to continuously elevate and have the organization commit to doubling down on sustainability performance and working in the branding department. We play our role in helping them craft great stories and also showing that the value, at least internally, of having a sustainability brand was worth it. And that was a very narrow audience, which was the executive committee. But it worked. Austin was a privilege to work for because we did the work. Like, we were beyond compliance and could rightfully claim the things that we said. My question is, that I'm getting to, is how would you say that, because you list a lot of examples of companies that are doing it wrong. I think H&M is a great example of them overextending their, their credibility in what they can communicate. But when you actually look at their sustainability strategy, if we park fast fashion as a scourge on society and sort of a bad example of growth-driven capitalism, which is not something H&M can solve, but if we then look at their sustainability performance, the categories that you mentioned from the Club of Rome, they are all delivering on that at length, right?
No.
To the extent that they're getting recognition from the bodies of being the best of an industry that is by nature exploited.
But is that just greenwashing making its work? Because
this is the performance of their reporting. Right? This is not because they can't go out and say close loop. I think the thing is, I agree that nobody's perfect to go out and say we're saving the world, but there is a need for the organization to be able to have a conversation, both externally and internally, and use the tools of branding and communication and positioning to drive the mindset of the organization, which is basically made up of people, so they can see the value. How do we also, as a community, support those initiatives?
Okay, can I take on from here?
Yes,
We have to step up a further level, because what happens with those initiatives is that they are often forfeited the moment that they don't economically make sense. It often is so. For example, now you say H&M, they have been promising on the topic of poverty alleviation for years and years to pay living wages. They made their first pledge in 2012. They should have delivered on it in 2019. Then it just vanished. So I think that when we look at how they make all of these bold claims, the issue is that they're still, driven by what will give them, as Marina also pointed to, the reputation that they crave to sell more products. If we are to think about businesses, and this is actually something that's also studied, if we are to think about businesses as resilient organizations working towards a new end, then they should also have limits to growth in place. They should control their greed, essentially. So if we return to the basis of needs, they should be asking, okay, what is it? What is the need that we're fulfilling here? Is it an actual need? And then they should strive to do it as well as they can. There is a small bag company, for example, in the UK, and they decided for them to live up to the regulations and for them to also be able to pay themselves a somewhat sensible wage, they would have to do 25 bags a week. And they figured, well, then we're just going to do 25 bags a week and do them really well and offer repair. And that's a very small business, but we've also seen this at larger businesses. So essentially, it's also about trying to, in your very business model, in the way that your business is formulated, to ensure that you cannot just get co-opted the next time the wind blows in a new direction. And this is a whole school. This is called post-growth business, essentially. So if you're really keen to know how we make resilient businesses in a world that just continues to overconsume, then I would say look there, because that toolbox is really, really something. I don't think that H&M should be commended for their work, even though I know that they're signed up for every possible charter out there. But let me just say that their greenwashing seeps into their reporting as well. I mean, we have to recognize that these CSRD reports, for example, they might also just be a vehicle of greenwashing, and they're actually also under the Danish law. And I hope that wasn't too broad, but Annette?
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you badass women. I have been a consultant in circular economy for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And there has been no lack of big businesses wanting to have progressive young voices coming in and challenging their business model and hosting innovation sprints and I don't know what. And it's been a great business for me personally, as I'm sure it is for you also, Tanya, to be invited into these establishments and like really challenge the structures. But I still haven't seen a single established business manage to change their actual logic of how they operate, how they, for example, measure impact, how they measure success, right? As you said, they're all so embedded in this structure of our economic system that growth at the end of the day is how they measure success.
Yes.
And I really wonder how we as advisors navigate this, right?
Yeah.
Because you say, let's go in and change the literacy. I feel like I've done that for the last 5 years, calling out the bullshit of our love with consumerism. But it doesn't change the economic structure. And I wonder, is there, for agencies, consultants, like, should we continue to try to work with the establishment? Or should we actually, as you also point to, focus on those newcomers that operate in a completely different way, completely different logic?
Yes, and there's multiple answers on my part to this, because within the established companies, we have individuals. And what I see in the research is that we are all living, or a lot of us are living with a bunch of cognitive dissonance. And I think speaking to that might actually mobilize people to either go do something else or actually mobilize within a company. I think the problem has been for so long that it's often just one individual, a few individuals within a company that tries to mobilize on this. So I think we should really talk to the breadth of that. But I also do think that when it comes to generally, you know, changing the goal of the system, one of the points that we haven't pointed to enough is that the economy will bust. It's made to boom, bust, quit. So if we look at an economy that's going to have, by 2070, 2090, that shows that the existing model isn't viable. And I think that that might actually get into the heads of some of those executives, because they're promising their boards that they will deliver on eternal growth. And they might actually get into trouble for that. So I think that that's also something that we haven't sufficiently pushed, if you ask me. So that's one way also that I would love to talk to executives. So yeah. Thank you. My pleasure. We're gonna cut it.